Jacques Ellul advocates for nonviolent resistance to evil throughout his writings, but there were moments in his life when he considered violent action. As he shares in an interview that took place near the end of his life, quote, "Because of my spiritual convictions, I am not only nonviolent, but I actually advocate meekness. Nonviolence is certainly not an effective method. From a realistic point of view, force will always win. But for me, it is at this point that faith comes into the equation. Jesus Christ, who acted without force, ended up as one of the prime movers in history. God is on the side of the meek, so they are the righteous, but that does not mean they succeed." Yet later, when asked about the role he played in the Spanish Civil War, Ellul responds, "I played a very modest role. My wife knew a certain number of young Spanish anarchists who came to France in search of weapons, and I tried to get some for them through an old school friend. The attempt failed, but still, there was an attempt." And likewise, when asked about his participation in the French resistance during the Second World War, Ellul says the following: "At the end of 1943, I had brought several young people to live with us who were coming to the end of their studies. We came to the conclusion that it would be better if we were armed. I got in contact with the network I worked with that provided forged documents, but was never able to track down any weapons. That's all there is to it. Had we been able to lay our hands on some revolvers or Tommy guns, no doubt we would have joined the armed resistance. And I was perfectly well aware that if I got involved in the fighting, I would be crossing over into the realm of necessity. But if I had to, I was quite prepared to give up my liberty." So how does one reconcile Ellul's stated commitments to nonviolence with what he shares in these interviews? The answer to this question is, as it usually is, complicated. And to try and simplify the answer is not only theoretically questionable, it's practically dangerous. For Ellul, it would risk generating justifications for violence that ought never to be justified. And as he writes in his book Violence, Reflections from a Christian Perspective, quote, "While violence is inevitable and belongs to the order of necessity, this fact does not legitimize it in the sight of God. Violence is contrary to the life in Christ to which we are called. Therefore, as Christians, we must firmly refuse to accept whatever justifications of violence are advanced. In particular, we must reject all attempts to justify violence on Christian grounds. So let me say once more, this applies to the violence of the powerful, of the capitalist, the colonialist, and the state, as well as the violence of the oppressed." Ellul was far from being the only European theologian who navigated these complex questions about and realities of violence during the war years. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, for example, is another such theologian who ascribed to nonviolence, famously wrestled with these kinds of questions, and ultimately decided to participate in a plot to assassinate Hitler. In this conversation, I speak with Bonhoeffer scholar Kevin O'Farrell, who shares his perspective on the extent to which Bonhoeffer's story and theology resist narration, systematization, and application, and how the complexity of this biography and witness issues both a challenge and an encouragement to people who want to resist evil without becoming evil in the process. As our conversation unfolds, it'll become evident that Ellul and Bonhoeffer shared similar contexts. Their theologies and ethics were forged in times of war and crisis, and both advocated for nonviolence, even though they, at times, were drawn into violence given extreme and some would say exceptional circumstances. My hope, then, is that this conversation complicates, in a good way, accounts of violence, accounts that are all too easily and dangerously simplified and systematized today. Well, welcome, Kevin. It's really
Hey,
awesome to
Mike.
have you here. How will we start by you introducing yourself a little bit? Tell us about Kevin O'Farrell. Who is Kevin O'Farrell? What are you doing these days? Why are you
Yeah,
here?
yeah, certainly. Thanks for inviting me, Michael. It's been way too long since we've had a conversation like this, so I guess a podcast is as good of reason as any to do this. Um, yeah, my name is Kevin. I am a theologian who lives in sunny Southern California, just outside of Los Angeles. In my current role in life, I work at a disability nonprofit ministry. It's called Johnny and Friends. It's a global disability ministry that serves in over 50 countries around the world. and I oversee their education and training with a particular focus on their theological training of pastors, denominational leaders, and the development of resources. So I'm actually working on developing a curriculum right now on disability ministry and theology for them. Uh, the other hat I wear is I am a academic and theologian, particularly in moral theology and political theology, and I have written on the work of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and particularly around the concept of the exception.
Yeah.
Michael and I, yeah, we did our PhDs together in Aberdeen, and that's what I was stewing away on as you were in the other corner working on Ellul and Virilio in the same office.
Yeah, yeah. Full disclosure, Kevin and I were office mates, and Kevin was a very good office mate. I can say that quite honestly and objectively. And so I basically heard Kevin's dissertation being written and thought out loud in real time, and it was the same for Kevin for me. And you were a good witness to me because you would always take breaks in the afternoon and take a walk in the botanical gardens, and my hyper focus wouldn't allow me to do that. And so I feel like you modeled, healthy discipline when it came to the academic work, whereas I didn't do that as well. So thank you for your witness.
I don't know if that's true, Michael. I think it's more that uh, you knew exactly what you were about and you were ready to get it out there. And I was just humming and hawing and trying to find my voice and needed to process. But you were a
Yeah,
witness to me of how to get it done.
maybe. But either way, we made it. Hey, look at
We
us.
did.
Who would have
Yeah, that's
thought?
right.
Who would have thought? This is why I want to talk to you though, because you are a Bonhoeffer scholar, and there's a lot of people talking about Bonhoeffer these days, whether it's in mainstream discourse or academic discourse. And the research that you've done and how you're writing and talking about Bonhoeffer's biography, his theology, all that sort of stuff, I think it's really worth other people hearing about. So let's start with Bonhoeffer himself. Why do you think that he continues to receive the attention that he's receiving today? What is it about him that is attracting so much scrutiny?
I think there's three general reasons why Bonhoeffer continues to get a lot of attention, just in general over the past 50 odd years. I think it's more than that now. Goodness. Um, but one is just that he is really just a genuinely interesting historical figure. He was a profound academic who wrote a lot and a lot of interesting and influential things. He was a globetrotter. He spent time in the US. He was going all around continental Europe. When he was in the US as well, he went to Cuba and Mexico as well, just a little gallivanting. So he just had a really wide and expansive life experience. And in the midst of that, he became really well connected to extremely interesting contemporaries of his. He formed a friendship with Karl Barth. He hung out with Martin Niemöller, and he was in the US with Reinhold Niebuhr. He spent time in Harlem. Like he just connected with a lot of really interesting people that um, makes him interesting in himself. And then, of course, he was a consistent critic of Nazism. He was a resistor, and we'll talk, I'm sure, a bit more about it. But he was part of this plot against Hitler, and he was an international spy of sorts. So when you put all that together, that's just interesting in itself and captures attention. Another reason I think he continues to get attention is because he really has something for everyone. Stephen Haynes' great little book, The Bonhoeffer Phenomenon, caught this a number of years ago, where he just identified and spelled out the way that he's been claimed as a representative and mouthpiece for basically everyone, from liberals to fundamentalists, pacifists, political realists, death of God theologians, liberation theologians. They're all claiming Bonhoeffer as their own.
Mm.
Um, and some of that, I think, is just because of the sheer diversity of his corpus and life situations, the ways he writes about different things, like on the fly. It's just like really compelling language and life experience that can appeal to so many people at the same time.
Mm.
Um, in a more theological sense, and this is something that I really think drives the interest in him, is that Bonhoeffer continues to speak a language for which people long. For a
Mhm.
lot of people, they describe their learning about Bonhoeffer as like a theological event or a life transforming event. And this is true for a lot of Bonhoeffer scholars. Like John DeGruchy has a book called A Lifelong Conversation with Bonhoeffer. There's this real sense that Bonhoeffer's putting words and to impulses and unarticulated convictions of people are trying to find their way in the world. And that in that way, he's just a really generative conversation partner.
Mm. Yeah.
Um, in terms of the now, I think the question you asked is why does he receive the attention right now? Um, I think one of the reasons why is just Bonhoeffer wrote from a world of crisis to a world of crisis.
Mm.
Um, he wrote in the midst of the rise of Nazism and the Third Reich, in the midst of World War II, and all sorts of other contemporary events. And he experienced the foundations of the world he knew crumbling under his own feet. Or as he wrote in After 10 Years, there's so little ground under his feet. Um, and we live in a time of similar crisis. Adam Tooze has called it a moment of polycrisis. There's just so
Mm.
many interrelated crises happening right now
Mm.
that it's hard to engage any of them, and the usual tools don't seem to be working. And so
Yeah.
Bonhoeffer speaks from into a world where we're looking for voices and role models to guide us.
Yeah. Yeah. And that actually like circles back to your initial point, like the appeal of a globe-trotting, cosmopolitan, German aristocratic Christian scholar and activist. I mean, there's so much there. And with all of those things, the pros and cons of it, he did the right thing.
Hmm.
Or uh, a lot of people would view what he did in plotting, being part of the plot to assassinate Hitler as doing the right thing. And so I kind of had this have this joke, but it's deadly serious in the sense of like, I think his story continues to have significance for a lot of people because he was one of the few white German Christians who did the right thing when the National Socialists came to power. And just the witness of that uh, continues to resonate out beyond his moment because it wasn't in his interest to resist. He probably would have benefited for the short and medium term before the fall of of the National Socialists from actually getting on board with what was happening. And so I think knowing that biographical detail then leads to okay, well, if despite it not being in his interest to resist the National Socialists, like what was it that motivated it? If
Hmm.
it wasn't, you know, these features of his context, then what was it? And then, of course, you get into his faith. And so I think that's kind of the inroad. And I talked to someone else about this, Trip Fuller, and he said that a lot of people do to Bonhoeffer what a lot of people do with Jesus is we fill him in with the projections of our thoughts, our values,
Hmm.
our desires, right? So uh, for some, he's a anarchist revolutionary hippie. For others, he's a effective CEO or whatever it is that we're carrying that we want to project that in and on to the figure of Jesus. We similarly do that with Bonhoeffer to sort of provide a philosophical and practical justification for whatever we think is right and wrong in the world.
No,
Um,
if I can say to that, that's
yeah,
one thing that it took me a while to articulate, but it's precisely that. Like in one
yeah,
sense, we want to identify people who live into what we want to be.
mhm,
And so we want Bonhoeffer to be this role model that we can point to and become. But at the same time, we want Bonhoeffer to be like us. So he
yeah,
becomes the projection of our very selves. And just to say, this has been kind of my tagline in the US, I think Bonhoeffer is so popular in part because there is kind of like a, for lack of a better word, like a fetish of like white guys with credentials to be like, I alone stand for the truth and I will combat against others. And so you find people like Bonhoeffer and Luther come to the fore precisely because of their single-minded stand for truth. Um, I do think Bonhoeffer stood for truth. I think he was quite incredible, but we can see the way that that can get skewed,
Yeah.
where in much different situations you're claiming a Bonhoeffer moment has arisen. So like there's almost like a desire for that same conflict to, I don't know, feel alive or something.
Oh, for real. Because I mean, you think about any, you know, guy scholar doing theology, like the Bonhoeffer moment is like their one chance to become Jason Bourne or like Chris Kyle,
Hmm.
American Sniper, right? And then and get the approval of God for making that move, right? And I'm like, I know in your work you're saying like that's actually not how it went, and that wasn't the theological philosophical thinking that led Bonhoeffer in the direction that he did. And practically speaking, like that's not what the best we know of his biography actually shows.
Yeah,
The final thing I would say is I think what's interesting is you as I hear you talk, I think about the formative power and witness of the saints of the church, uh and and the fact that he wrote within crisis, to a world of crisis, is I think his his particular offering to those of us who are in this communion of saints, in this ongoing dialogue, trying to figure out what it means to in a be a Christian in better or worse times. And I think that that really does speak to why there's a lot of interest in not just Bonhoeffer, but a lot of, post-war theological thinkers, because there's a you don't go looking for it, you don't romanticize it, but there's a clarifying effect to your theology when you go through something as terrible as the First and Second World Wars, right? I
that's
mean,
right.
this is why I think Ellul's writing is so helpful, or Barth's writing is so helpful, or any of the other thinkers that are coming from that particular context, is that experiencing what they did, the horrors that they did, and some of the triumphs, I guess you could say as well, but it produced, um, it crystallized some pretty powerful thought that we're still working through today. And I think his Bonhoeffer's uh, work is an example of that for sure.
That's right. I've liked the description of this by Robert Vosloo. He has a great article called Bonhoeffer, Our Contemporary, and he
Mm,
uses a Gomben to talk about how Bonhoeffer becomes contemporary by taking these times out of joint, and they almost become like fissures or like breaks within linear time, and that becomes like a place for intergenerational discourse. So people from crisis meet someone in this time of crisis, and in these gaps in history or in these breakages, that becomes a place where the past speaks into the present with force.
mhm.
And we become passive to that voice and receive like a lesson at the same time. It's a fun
Yeah.
article. I really like it.
One of the things that I see with Bonhoeffer quite uniquely is he's become a bit of this ideological battleground, and in some cases he's been weaponized as a sort of uh, more than a person, more than a biography, more than a theological perspective, but as a sort of uh, tool, uh, in the toolkit of sort of social and political movements, right? Why is it that he represents that as compared to like nobody's
Hmm.
doing a movie about Bart or Paul Tillich yet. And right, it's like or no, like Fox News isn't featuring people, or MSNBC, they're not having people talking about Karl Barth in the way that they would maybe about Bonhoeffer. So can you give us a little bit of your insight into why he's kind of at the center point of a lot of the ideological battleground that we're seeing these days?
Yeah, that's also a good question. I mean, the most basic version of it, of why him versus someone like a Bart or a Tillich, is I do think it's the biography. I
Hmm.
mean, he was part of a high level conspiracy against Hitler. He wasn't, you know, uh, the centerpiece of it. He was quite periphery and marginal, but he was arrested in 1943 on for unrelated reasons, but ultimately it was his participation in the plot that led to his execution as it
Mhm.
was uncovered in 1945. Like he wrote from prison, he resisted in quite incredible ways. Like that leads so much to it. Um, and it is suggestible. And I think what we see with him becoming a place of uh, as you called it, an ideological battleground, so to speak, is that it is the sort of narration that can easily be constrained and pulled in directions that can tell the story that you want to tell. And I think that's the key thing that Bonhoeffer's scholarship has really pushed against with regards to like the move to the so-called popular Bonhoeffer in this Bonhoeffer moment. You can take the biography and you can narrate the life in such a way and all the different details and even bits and pieces of his language to construe a story that forwards the ideals and values that you want to project into the world. And that has it's quite compelling to people, understandably so. Bonhoeffer is compelling, and if you can tell a story that forwards the cause, that can be great benefit, but it also does violence to the individual.
Yeah.
Um, this is kind of a sidetrack, but I think that's the sort of thing that happened with John Vanier.
Mm.
People had these ideals and values they wanted to see existing within disability theology and ministry. They see this in L'Arche. They identified Jean Vanier as a contemporary saint, but what did we learn after the fact? It wasn't as clean of a narration as we think. It's not to say that Bonhoeffer has the same skeletons and abuse as Vanier, but it's a way of saying it creates a neat and tidy story that, in many instances, is forwarding a picture we've already decided we want to tell.
Mm.
And Bonhoeffer fits into that pretty well. Um, I do think the Bonhoeffer movie becomes a pretty um, straightforward narration of Bonhoeffer in this lens. It's a sort of thing that tells a very particular story that forwards a vision that takes excessive liberties, but is going to be taken as truth by a lot of people.
Mm. I'd be interested to hearing your thoughts on where there is aspects of the story that have been portrayed that would be taken as truth, but you don't think that it would be a good thing for it to be taken as such. And of course, my impression from viewing the film was it's based on the biography, and there's obviously been a pretty good amount of research done, but it's a work of historical fiction, not unlike a
Mhm.
TV series like The Crown. Um, it's easy to watch a show like The Crown and get immersed in it and think it's representing history as it was.
Mhm.
And it's not even as if the showrunners of The Crown are saying it was exactly like this. And in fact, my understanding was that the royal family wanted a disclaimer off the front to be like,
That's
this
right.
isn't a totally accurate representation
That's
of
right.
events. And they were like, no, we're not doing that. But so it's kind of the tension between, quote unquote, getting history right and what does it mean to get history right?
That's right.
And there are some people that in reviews I read, it's like Bonhoeffer didn't play piano in jazz clubs with the jazz musicians. That's not historically. It's like, who cares? It's kind of cool seeing Bonhoeffer walk into a jazz club in New York and play the piano. You know, like maybe he probably didn't, but it's kind of
Yeah.
cool.
No,
Also,
that's right.
I want to know, this is what I want to know off the top, and I'm going to ask this director if we end up talking is what was with that haircut early on? Is that historically accurate? Because I'm like, who made those decisions for that
Yeah.
haircut? Like, not
He
that it
did.
really mattered. But the basic point is like there are some things that are just creative moves that you make that
Yeah.
don't cash out ideologically, right? And then there are moves that you make that do, and we have to be aware of. So I'd be interested in hearing your thought. But my ultimate experience of watching that film was that I just said it's a parable. It's a parable. And like it because some of the discussions, like the dialogue, it was like philosophy or theology being done live, and it felt a little bit more like theater than it did um like a genuine sort of dialogue. And I felt approaching it like a parable is the most helpful way to approach that film. um not
So,
not an
a
action film, not a document that's representing history accurately, but it's somebody telling a story about somebody significantly based on the research and saying, like, here is my interpretation of the Bonhoeffer story. Try to find what you can out of it. That was Michael's
yeah.
experience, for what it's worth.
Um, Yeah, I think that's fair. And there's a certain sense for me, like I laughed at the jazz club, I'm not though it did remind me of La La Land. Like Ryan Gosling is in the
Oh yeah.
jazz club and everyone steps aside for, him to do to be center stage sort of thing. I had total La La Land
You were waiting for the dance
comparison there.
number.
That's right. Um, but I think for me, where I was gesturing with that is actually precisely in um, the way that they have Bonhoeffer basically like I think this could be quibbled with a bit, but I'll
Yep.
try to explain where it's almost like theology was of no use in that moment, or like his
Hmm.
role in uh, uh, thinking through the future through a theological lens. There's a couple key moments where if you remember at the end of the Finkenwald a bit, he hears Berlin's on fire and he's like, now's not a time for teaching and prayer. Now's a time for action. And then he moves on there. And then when Hans comes to him with the plot in the attic, um,
Hmm.
he's like, uh, basically says like, theology is of no use now. We need to be men of action. It's going to require dirty hands. And then, Bonhoeffer says, all I have are dirty hands to offer.
Yeah.
Um, there's this real sense throughout it that there's an impotency to the theological vision of Bonhoeffer, and it really becomes as boiled down to as there's right and there's wrong, and I'm going to
Yeah.
stand for that.
Yeah.
Um, the other thing that I think uh, where I would quibble maybe with some of the historical accuracy bit um, is I think within these narrations, when you so idealize Bonhoeffer, it actually takes away our ability to see his weakness and shortcomings and even criticize him within a historical lens. So, as if he was always on the right side of history and everything he did had a sheerly, altruistic a motivation behind it. And that in itself, I think, is questionable and curtails our ability to wrestle realistically with who Bonhoeffer is.
Hmm.
And that becomes dangerous. The thing with the movie that I think where you do describe it as a parable and the lesson being offered, which I do find something that makes me hesitant, is precisely this real movement to describe Bonhoeffer as a freedom fighter who will do whatever it takes by any means to achieve the right end. That's the sort of vision I begin to see towards the end. We can talk about that in relation to Bonhoeffer's, the sort of rationales he forwards, but this self-assuredness is the sort of thing that some scholars have highlighted as just veering towards fanaticism in an unhealthy way. And if the game is to find who the Nazi is, if you claim someone's a Nazi, then you can basically justify it however you want to
Yep.
do it, or say, oh, I'm not justifying it, but never has there been an emergency situation like this before. So we are compelled to go into it. Like that in itself can be dangerous. And that's
Yeah.
the sort of thing the movie, I think, moves in the direction of.
Yeah. Yeah. And actually, it does remind me of one of the primary impressions that I had was he starts out as idyllic as you can get, right? In the German countryside in a big house with a wonderful, upper class German family. And all the way through, he's this idealist. Like, he's an embodiment of the ideal, and he holds to these theological ideas. And you just see thing after thing eroding that idealism, and it's crumbling. And uh at the end of it, those scenes that you talk about, it is the sort of total erosion of the ideal and move into pragmatism
Hmm.
that uh I think
But
you're
there's a certain idealism that drives the pragmatism. Like
yeah,
in
yeah,
the
yeah, yeah,
end, like,
totally, totally. But it's like
there's,
it's the idealism that it's the idealism that sort of makes the pragmatism
Mhm.
okay. So you move from like, German philosophical theological idealism into like American Niebuhrian uh critical realism and the
That's
impossible
right.
possibility of like that platonic ideal of like doing right even when it
Hmm.
costs you is up here. And we should aim for love, but the best we can do within the wider society is justice.
Yeah.
And so that to me is like the movement of like, you know, even the movement from like Germany to America and then back. It's like he learns that in America to carry it back in order to sort of, like you said, it's pragmatism, but it's sort of baptized in the one ideals that we can't let go. And there's a history to that, right? Like this isn't just two or a bunch of different scholars like quibbling about this, but there have been people who have viewed his story in that way to actually, as you gesture to, uh, carry out acts of violence and think that they're okay doing it. And I guess that's kind of why I my response to it was ambivalent because I'm like, oh yeah, I mean, we're always looking for excuses to kill people or do violent things and feel
Yeah.
okay about it. And of course, for Christians in North America, like we're totally fine, it seems, uh, abiding by that sort of pragmatism baptized in ideals so that we can feel like God approves when we do something violent. And having read your book and had conversations about it, you're like, actually, if we're paying close enough attention to his story and the theology and how it worked out, he won't let you do that. He won't let you jump so quickly into those sorts of conclusions and actions.
Yeah, that's right. And I think in the end, I do think the movie is a very American portrayal of an idealized Bonhoeffer. And I think, for better or for worse, I think it's for worse. But when I talk about, the demonizing of others and finding Nazis, like, I think I actually don't know this officially. You can tell me, like, I'm guessing Eric Metaxas' biography kind of becomes part of the motivation for this movie and inspiration as
Hmm.
well. I think he
I'm not
interacted
sure.
with the others, but I don't know. It's a guess on my part, but at a minimum, the Metaxas biography became a cultural event in the U.S. And we see the way that he used the biography of Bonhoeffer, particularly in the 2016 election, and it's continued onwards to um, label the Democratic Party as Nazis. And he called like Hillary Clinton, and said Bonhoeffer would vote for Trump rather than another. And just within that, you're seeing a way that um, uh, you have the same sort of self-assured vision. You are able to make the enemy of something you don't like, and then that's used to bolster a particular program that can be more mundane to more violent. Um, and I think the movie works in that same direction on the whole.
Hmm. Yeah, I think the one piece that kind of nuances it a bit, at least for me, I'd be interested to
Mhm.
hear your thoughts if it holds up. And then I want to hear your sort of account of how we ended up in this plot and what theology was at play in it. But near the end, they're in the prison. He's about to be executed along with other people, and they ask him to, hold a mini church service, and they receive
Mhm.
communion. And um, when he invites the guard to
That's right.
participate, and other people are saying, like, what are you doing? And the reactions of the people, does that nuance it at all for you, or do you still feel like it doesn't hold up against the sort of momentum of the other pieces that we've been talking about?
It's funny you've brought it up because I was literally just thinking. So, full disclosure, I only watched the film 3 days ago. I rented it, and I was like, you know what? I'm talking about Bonhoeffer with Michael. I might as well watch it. So that's why
Let's
it
do it.
keeps coming up for me because it's just
Yeah.
been on
Good.
the forefront of my mind. I'm not, it's not just because it's an easy thing to talk about. It's just really the most recent thing I watched.
Yeah.
But I was thinking about that that scene when I was driving to work today, and I thought to myself, in one sense, it was quite this is different, but it was almost like, Bonhoeffer used the language I hear people use at like open table communion, like where no one is barred. So I thought, oh, that's like a really interesting um, thing to come from his lips based on uh, uh, just where he is in the movie. There is a stark contrast between that scene and what comes before. And I don't know, what's your take on it? I was actually wrestling with how to narrate that, how much it changes the vision, because it is a humanizing move.
Hmm.
Um, uh, I guess there's also a part of me that's like, this sounds weird to say, but is it almost like the movie goes at pains to show that there are like a lot of people who participated within uh, the Nazi regime um, were almost had like uh, moments of self-doubt or compassion or empathy throughout, like the guards listening in on Bonhoeffer crying, or now this one who's coming in for communion, like almost if it uh, diminishes how wholeheartedly people bought into it at the same time. Anyways, those are just rambling thoughts. Tell me what you think.
Yeah, I mean, one way to read it is that, it's a micro level humanization of
Hmm.
the quote unquote enemy, but the macro level enemy is still the enemy, right?
Hmm.
And of course, if you move in that direction, then the the micro gets lost within the macro commitment to, bringing down the empire and killing the villain and, installing something new and better. Um, the other piece too is, as you're talking, what comes to mind for me is William Cavanaugh's book Torture in the Eucharist,
That's right.
and how the of course there is a certain openness to the table of Christ. I mean, Christ himself says, I came for the sick, not the healthy. Go away and figure out what this means. And the point is, we're all sick. Uh, and if you think you're not, then you're never going to sit down at this table, because only the people who are willing to admit that they are sick will even bother sitting down, let alone like uh, seeing that they should be here, right? So like applying the discussion at hand, it's to me, it's maybe actually in that moment the most human and sort of Christ representing thing is to say, we're doing this, but you're not, because you're like you haven't yet come to the point where you're willing to admit the wrong that you've become complicit in. And this
Yeah,
is
that's
something that the church does, at least ostensibly. This is something that we do totally transparent to God and each other as we approach the table and say, um, I need a physician and I can't cure myself. I need Christ. And so the fact that we would uh maybe treat it in such a trivial and sort of dispensable way, not dispensable way, but just so easily invite in and then feel like, oh, that's great. Like, does that tie up too neatly and too nicely? Whereas the account that Kavanaugh gives in Torture and Eucharist is like, there were people attending church together where the people who were the police arresting and disappearing and torturing bodies were worshiping next to the family members. And one of the critical moments for the church was to say, until you repent of what you have done and you take steps to right this wrong, you don't get to approach the table. And how does that become the location of our resistance to principalities and powers? And in this world, we look at that and we're like, well, what does that mean? Not much.
yeah.
But
No,
actually, it means everything in a way.
yeah. That's a really good reference, Michael. And I think you put a lot more succinctly and eloquently what I was trying to get at with like where I kind of hummed and hawed with that scene is precisely that dynamic. I did think that the scene may have been even an appeal to show like a continuity of sorts, that like Bonhoeffer's strong emphasis on enemy love from earlier. I mean, it continues, but especially in the discipleship era. Though again, you think about his movements uh of cheap grace and costly discipleship. It's yeah, within all of it, I guess there's a worry of a cheapness to that scene and the overarching flow of the film, but in many ways, like it is a quite a compelling scene, like almost like you could view it as like, a glimpse into this reconciliation beyond the war that
Yeah.
Christ can enact and right before the execution. But I don't know. I That's truly unfiltered thoughts.
And
Like,
that's why I think it's just
yeah.
helpful to treat it like a parable because you can spend a lot of time going back and forth as we are trying to unpack what this means, how it leads in this direction or that
Yeah.
direction. And I do think it's helpful because you understand a little bit of, about just again why we're still talking about this individual and the social, political, you know, cultural influence that he has. Let's move then to your understanding of how things went down. So just to sort of concretize it a little bit, like how did he come to participate in this plot? And when he decided to become a part of it, what theology was at play for him? Because your argument is that it wasn't like, okay, let's leave that behind. It's not helpful here. You're like, no, actually, it was very critical in his journey. So, can you
Hmm.
share a little bit about those things?
Yeah, certainly. So, um, the movement into the plot really begins. I mean, he became a resistor very early on, or at least an outspoken critic. Um, I think it was like in 1933 when he had that radio address on uh, uh, oh, I'm blanking on the name of it. The one where he says like that Hitler isn't a Führer, but he's not a leader,
Right.
he's a misleader, that whole thing.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, I'm embarrassed I can't think of it off the top of my head. And the radio transmission gets cut off. Probably not because he was being censored, but the point is early on he spoke critically against it. Fast forward a few years, Finkenwalde has been shut down. There's kind of been this scattering of the pastors, and Bonhoeffer is in a precarious legal situation. I think at this point he has been declared an enemy of the state, and he has been pleaded with and encouraged to go to the U.S. With the imminent war to be at Union Theological Seminary. Niebuhr has helped made the way for him. His ecumenical contacts are like, you should go. And so he goes to the US and um, is there. And then in the summer of 1939, he decides he needs to go back. He writes this letter that says, "I can't be a part of the reconstruction of Germany if I'm not there to go through these struggles," in essence. And so in July of 1939, he heads back to Germany. Now uh, his brother-in-law, Hans von Dohnanyi, he is part of the Abwehr, the German Secret Service, and he works to have Bonhoeffer become an agent for them. This was in part to avoid conscription into the front lines. That was one way, so Bonhoeffer wouldn't have to do that, as well as this is where he's ushered into the plot, so to speak. So there's a high level military plot to assassinate Hitler, and Bonhoeffer is brought into it in part to use his ecumenical contacts in different parts of Europe, basically to go to allied countries and figure out if people would give room for Germany to rebuild if they're able to topple the government and set up something else. Now, unlike the film, just to say clearly, he was never, to bring bomb parts back in from England into Germany. He was very tertiary on the whole to the plot. Even for a couple of the assassination attempts that occurred, it's not even clear that Bonhoeffer knew about them occurring. There are ones where he did, but there's just a certain sense that he became on the fringes of the movement, and his role was really to seek ally building. Um, he was arrested in 1943. due to discrepancies in clerical paperwork. That was connected to Operation Seven, where they worked to have baptized Jews, family members who are Jewish, and friends of other people Abwehr related, uh, to transport them to Switzerland for safe haven. And they basically took money from the Abwehr, brought it to Switzerland for to help with their settlement and for people to take care of them. Anyways, there were discrepancies in bookkeeping. The Gestapo was looking into it, kind of the rival agency figured this out, and he got arrested um, at that time. And he only became executed in 45 when the diary of Canaris, who was one of the high level leaders of this plot, um, his diary was found when he was arrested, and it outlined these plots. And it was then that they were all swiftly taken
Yeah.
for execution. So you can just see
It's
like
not very
it's
Hollywood, right? It's like,
no, it
oh, it's a
isn't.
clerical error or mix up, right? Like that
Yeah,
we can do away with that piece. But I think it's
yeah.
important that those things fit in of like that doesn't play well. Like you can't it doesn't sensationalize very easy.
Yeah, and that's where like people really grimace at the language of assassin for Bonhoeffer because
Hmm.
he just wasn't going to be assassin. He was quoted as saying that he would like pull the trigger if it was up to him, more of a way of saying like
Hmm.
I stand behind this.
Yeah.
But in no realistic scenario were they looking to Bonhoeffer to ever do that. And
Hmm.
so yeah, that's the more realistic picture of
Yeah.
what was happening with him.
Yeah. And in terms of the theological piece, your your work is going to great lengths to show through engagement with other scholars who are also trying to engage that piece of like
Mhm.
what was going on theologically for him as he's really wrestling over whether or not he should participate because he was sort of a just war theory advocate and then he became a pacifist because of the influence
Mhm.
of one of his friends and committed to pacifism and then of course participated in this plot to the extent that, at the very least, theoretically saying that he would stand by, the assassination attempt, if not pull the trigger himself, theoretically. So what was going on for him theologically that that made that shift for him?
Yeah, I think one thing to say is, and this is more of a point within Bonhoeffer's scholarship, but I think it's worthwhile here is Bonhoeffer does use the language of pacifism, but a lot of scholarship says that he held to a peace ethic.
Yeah. Okay.
And one of the reasons is because for him, ethics has always been like non-ideologically based. And to maintain freedom for Christ's command, there could hypothetically be a situation within which,
Yeah.
you're called to kill. And the reason
I've
why I
always
bring
yeah.
this up is there's a certain sense of like, it's a question of how discontinuous is there the movement from like Finkenwalde and the emphasis on the Sermon on the Mount, and then the shift into active conspiracy and what sort of theological break occurs there. So in emphasizing that, uh, I'm kind of making a claim to some version of continuity, but maybe not wholesale within
Yeah.
it.
Because I mean the whole discussion, not even just in Bonhoeffer scholarship, but just any sort of theological or philosophical discussion of violence versus peace is like what do we mean when we say pacifism? And I'm,
Mhm.
tempted to quote Hauerwas here. You know, I don't think it means what it actually means, or like you're
Yeah,
interpreting it wrongly often, right? So yeah, I think it is helpful because again, it just shows how much uh thought was going into this, and it's much more complicated of an account than we often get from the more mainstream discourse. This
yeah,
leads you into the area of the exception, which isn't like limited to Bonhoeffer's um, story or theology. It's a theme that pops up a lot. So can you talk a little bit about the exception and how that plays into your reading of what's going on for Bonhoeffer and like really quite practically like why does it even matter?
yeah.
Because I think it does, and your account of it actually is compelling. But I think just for people to hear like what does it matter for today?
Yeah. Um, so the exception at its core is, I mean, the most simple explanation I can give is it's situations where you feel constrained to break or exceed the law in your action. And that can be in like a moral sense, like, breaking the commandment to not kill, or even in a political sense, like what does it mean to break the law and do
Mm,
something that you think is right? Like those become quite intersected, and you can see how that would come to the fore in something like joining a plot against Hitler. There's questions about telling the truth because Bonhoeffer is a double agent, so he's lying all the time. So, what is it? How do you reconcile being someone who lies? Or how do you reconcile being someone who is basically participating in a plot to take someone's life? Like these are grave issues, and these are the sort of things that can really trouble souls without any clear um, oh, I should definitely do this or not. So it can lead to an angst. I think the exception also, and this is probably the bit that really drove me more to think about it, is really asking the question of like, what does it mean to act Christianly in a moment when the typical forms of thoughts and structures that are all around you seem to be crumbling or don't seem to offer life. Um, it's the sort of thing of when there's a transition of eras or there's sheer destruction in the wake of what's going on. Everything that you were told is important doesn't seem to be in use or has proven to be illusory. Like, what does
mm,
it mean to live when the foundations have been destroyed?
mm.
Um, that's the sort of thing that comes up in exception discourse. It's become particularly relevant in recent years. There's been kind of a new wave of reflection on it through figures like Giorgio Agamben or Carl Schmidt around states of exception. So, what does it even mean for governments to claim emergency measures? In a certain sense, Bonhoeffer would fit into this as well. Schmidt very famously said that the decision of the sovereign precedes law within polity. So there's a real sense that law doesn't form political authority. Political authority authorizes law. And what the reason why this matters in part is Schmidt became a very ardent Nazi. So when Hitler, through Article 48, suspends the Constitution and takes uh, direct authority. He views that as the just claim of political authority to take over the state. And so there becomes this real discussion within it of what is the relationship between law and action, or between authority and law, both in ethical and political senses. So all of this is
Yeah,
in the background of a
yeah,
discussion around of exception. And I think all of it is of contemporary significance for us as individuals in the muck and mire of history, and as well as reflecting on when governments that are increasingly making claims to emergency measures, like how do we understand that and respond?
yeah,
Um, those are a couple of contemporary facets that play
yeah.
into this.
Yeah, I appreciate you mentioning Agamben because I remember actually reading Agamben in my undergrad, and this was right around the time that 9/11 had happened, and of course the war on terror kicked
Mhm.
off in the wake of it. And um, Agamben takes this point of that you mentioned the state of emergency, right? That it's the declared state of emergency by the sovereign or whoever's in political power that is often used as a justification for whatever it is that the sovereign power says is right. We're doing this for your own good, but when we return to normalcy, then we'll go back to regular laws. And ever since then, wow, it's quite interesting that we've never not been in a state of emergency since George Bush and his like that's the risk of it, right? And I think Agamben is bringing that into our current moment and how much of that has like laid the architecture, theoretically and very practically for our current moment. And I remember actually, if we're talking about movies, the class that I was in, we watched V for Vendetta,
All right.
using Agamben's work as a sort of hermeneutic to understand the fanaticism and violence and terrorism, right? So if you exist in this world where political power has taken over it, declares a state of emergency, and is, become authoritarian in the process. What then do you do, right? And of course, the V character represents the sort of hero anti-hero figure that is willing to engage in acts of violence, some would call terrorism, in order to
Hmm.
bring down the authoritarian state. And of course, like, well, now we're in the territory of our moment, where there are militias and there are overthrows and there are demonstrations and attempts at all these sorts of things, uh, all because of this environment of emergency and suspension of
Yeah.
right and wrong, right? In order to do right, I must do wrong, and for a higher purpose, right? So that is why it's worth talking about these things, because these are the sorts of things that we tell ourselves as we're in the very real soup of life. And some people are like, I don't know, can't we just get along and not
Yeah.
be violent? And well, that's becoming less and less tenable as an option. So if not that, then what? Yeah.
Yeah. And I think a good connection here to like the Bonhoeffer bit is precisely that Bush made an appeal to Bonhoeffer before the invasion of Iraq.
Mm, mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm.
so there's a place where, and that was the sort of thing that drove Clifford Green, who's a senior Bonhoeffer scholar, who is probably uh, he was one of the key figures to make the critical edition of the Bonhoeffer works available in English and have that translated. Like he is just old guard Bonhoeffer, and that really disturbed him the way that Bonhoeffer's legacy was used there. And then that continued actually uh, uh, with Jean Elshtain, where she uses the concept of dirty hands and taking on guilt actually to um, defend the use of torture in Iraq, as well as, these are emergency times, and sometimes you gotta do what you gotta do to defend and act responsibly for others. You take on the guilt yourself in love. And that's the theme of torture coming up for us again. But you can see how it interrelates here. Maybe it would be helpful to describe what my work is doing by
Yeah, do
actually
it.
beginning with what Clifford Green does, because I actually think Green's model is um, the best contemporary version. I disagree with it, but it's the one that I took most seriously in the writing of my work, because his is self-consciously set against fanatical uses by George Bush or someone like Paul Hill, who did a mass shooting at an abortion clinic claiming there's a Holocaust against babies. So I need to do this just like Bonhoeffer. So he's looking at those moments and saying, how do you read Bonhoeffer well to constrain against these illegitimate uses? And Clifford Green ends up pointing to the tyrannicide tradition in order to bolster this. So this dates back to Roman times. Cicero talks about tyrannicide, but in certain moments, political authority is so abused that the authority becomes a tyrant. And in such moments, the populace is justified or validated to depose of the tyrant by violent means. And while Clifford doesn't speak of a higher law within Bonhoeffer's work, there's this real sense that under the right circumstances, as a last resort, you can take the risk of action in such a way that could lead to tyrannicide. And there is some textual warrant for that, insofar as Bonhoeffer knew that tyrannicide was actually a thing. He lectures on it at Finkenwalde. And he describes Hitler a lot as a tyrant or as the tyrannical despiser of humanity. So there's some like textual clues that that could be a direction to go. And that has become really the mainstream, as I see it, most compelling version for a lot of Bonhoeffer scholars. Michael de Young takes a similar version of it to say Bonhoeffer has this hierarchy, or this almost flow chart of resistance. So you go through the certain steps, and once you've exhausted all the options, then you can take the act of tyrannicide as an individual actor, basically. Um, it is compelling, but the place where, and it's often very close to the text in these readings, and they're able to pick up genuine aspects of it that are true by and large. I end up pushing against it in my work, and you can think of it as um, uh, uh, I became dissatisfied with some of the readings, and I was trying to figure out why. And this is maybe why I kept walking in the botanical gardens during the PhD. Um, but I came to realize that I found these narrations almost too neat and tidy, as if when we talk about the exception, it's the sort of thing that we're talking about in an armchair, like smoking a cigar and drinking. Like it's something that's like there's a moral scenario. If we can accurately describe what's happening, we can discern whether it is the right time to make the leap of the last resort that goes into the no man's land of concern. But there's a certain sense within these articulations that there's a self-possessedness of the person who's discerning, or as if you're looking at it from the outside, trying to figure out if you're to go in. Um, and I began to think, what about the passivity of the self to this moment? There's something to what Larry Rasmussen said that Bonhoeffer was thinking in a moment of epochal crisis, and he didn't have time to think it all out. That his thought is actually quite conflicted, and it isn't um, so self-possessed and articulate to form a coherent system. Are there fissures and fragments within it that allow us to read it differently? And I began to, and that was part of it for me, is he has this essay, History and Good Too. That's the one that everyone points to as being his most mature account of resistance and forwarding a theology of the exception. And as I read it, I kept thinking, I actually don't think this essay is self-possessed. It seems to be arguing different things that don't seem to cohere. It felt unfinished to me and like it could offer different readings. Um, and then I came across the work of Matthew Puffer, who talks precisely about the way that Bonhoeffer didn't just have one account of breaking the law or resistance, but he changes it over the course of his time. And that gave me this textual warrant to be like, oh, wait, Bonhoeffer doesn't speak in a singular voice about this. It's actually quite fragmentary and even broken. There's a lot that's in there, but we can begin to read it less as a mature expression of a single identifiable intention and theology of exception as much as experiments in figuring out how do we find the language for which we're seeking and grasping after. Um, uh, just to quickly give I think it's important to say, like, this is the basic crux of Matthew's argument, which I think is right. People used to take History and Good Too as late Bonhoeffer in the Ethics. So the Ethics is his unfinished magnum opus that he's been writing from like his return from Germany in 39 until he's arrested. And it History and Good Too is dated in 1942, which is towards the end. So they were like, okay, this is him really coming to terms and figuring it out. Um, he identifies that when Bonhoeffer gets access to Barth's Church Dogmatics, Volume 2, he changes his ethical theory dramatically. And he writes God's Love and the Disintegration of the World, an essay soon after. God's Love used to be dated to 1939. So they used to say, oh, that's early ethics, and then he changes. But rather, it's written after History and Good Too. The reason why that's important is basically all the language of taking on guilt and doing wrongdoing, of breaking the law and love of neighbor, all that language goes away. And Bonhoeffer starts talking in the mode of um, the will of God is singular and without conflict. The will of God is above the law of contradiction. That when you say yes to the call of Christ, it supersedes the laws of this age, and there's a inner simplicity to Christian action. So it moves from conflict and law breaking into unity. And then in 1943, he writes an essay, What Does It Mean to Tell the Truth? And there, Bonhoeffer reverses what he says in History and Good Too. In History and Good Too, he says, he uses the law in a Kantian sense to say, if someone knocks on your door and asks if your neighbor is there so they can kill them, you should say no to preserve the life of the neighbor. And he says, but you've still broken the law of lying and you've taken on guilt. And what does it mean to tell the truth? In the same scenario, Bonhoeffer would say, you have not told a lie by saying no. The other individual told the lie by breaking the law of love by asking you an inappropriate question, basically. So the act of truth telling is to dissuade the person asking for them. So you begin to see right there, he's changing how you articulate what law breaking looks like.
Yeah.
Um, I can give more examples, but that's this general flow of saying, okay, what he wrote in 1942, that became the basis of appeals by George Bush. It becomes appeals to tyrannicide and all these other things. What if that wasn't the final word or even the most important word in Bonhoeffer's work? How do we go from there? And I viewed that as an entry point to figure out how can we read Bonhoeffer on the exception. And I picked up on the themes of history and temporality to really ask about the nature of the law and free action that moves after it. Should I keep
Yeah.
going or should
No,
I,
no, no. I
I
think that's
pause
very
there?
no, that's very helpful because I think it just shows the nuance to Bonhoeffer's
Yeah.
story theology, the changes and how much it resists a clean systemized narrative
Mhm.
or like moral framework that we can just sort of export out of it and then sort of apply in any other situation that takes this out of the everyday life and normalcy into a moment as stressful or as difficult as he was in, or even ones that are comparable or less so. And I think that is the value of what you're saying is don't turn this very complicated situation of crisis that had multiple voices within one person, the stress of the environment, don't try to turn that into an infinitely repeatable scenario that can be turned into a law, especially if it involves a law that justifies violence.
Mhm.
Like it's an example of a unique, unpredictable moment of history that you can't tame. And so, what happens if we let the kaleidoscope of things that you just described uh, be what it is without trying to assemble it into a sort of coherent puzzle piece and say, um, he never felt like he was completely justified and he
Mhm.
never felt like he shouldn't have done what he did. And there was nuanced theological, philosophical, practical thinking. Um, and he did take a leap, as it were, trusting that whatever happened, that it was on God to determine how things would go and what was right and wrong versus any one human saying, yeah, you're totally right. I would have done the same thing and we should all do the same thing, right?
For me, a couple of the lessons I took as I follow this argument out for me is the exception becomes first and foremost not actually about our action, and this is what you were just gesturing at, but about God's action in history. So what I do, and I think this is right, is um, uh, Bonhoeffer, as he's writing about this, he's really focusing on God's action in history and the character of history. I don't think it's an accident that the essay that's identified as Bonhoeffer speaking most closely to the exception is called History and Good Too. And throughout it, he's wrestling what is good historical action and what does it mean to act well, and the fragmentariness and relativity of history. And the ultimate move he falls into there is a way of saying, he says, my freest action is actually passivity. It's God's action working through me. And that's the profound mystery of history being revealed in us, that God is working in and through us, and even despite us, moving forward to seek a new world, one within which that law and polity is restored. And that, in a certain sense, is through us, but beyond us at the
Mm.
same time. Um, so I actually end up using history in a way of like law and gospel in Luther. So in one sense, history reveals the illusion of our self-control or the sufficiency of our ethics and politics to guide us in all situations. Those, just like the rest of creation, are fallen entities that offer relative goods. They're penultimate, to use that sort of language. In a real sense, in the exception, God is revealing simultaneously its fallenness as well as a liberation to seek the new here and now, and the promise of God that can break in and renew um, society and polity and individual action in the midst of its sheer destruction and the seeming loss of agency within us. So if we have that move happen, the question I ask is how can we read all these Bonhoeffer themes in a different light, one that offers the hope of reconciliation in the future beyond even just the horizon that he could see?
Yeah, thank you. And it does. I mean, even just hearing that, it offers a tangible, substantial possibility for hope and reconciliation without spilling over into the risks of violence. So, and sort of self-righteous or self-justified or fanatical violence. So, as we wind down here, I just want to give you the opportunities like to concretize even further practically of like the value of just saying, hey, don't think you're warranted theologically or otherwise into fanaticism, thinking that you're the exception, right? But like that's a very sort of ham-fisted way of putting it. But how would Kevin put it as we wind down here?
Like, sorry, what's that like?
Well, how do
Why
you
is why is that?
how do we turn this non-ethic into an ethic, I guess, because we're both ethicists. So,
Yeah. I mean, there's two very practical things that I take from this as being important ethically. One is that I actually think it delegitimizes or it disempowers the role of violence even more than the tyrannicide notion.
mm,
Because within tyrannicide, there's a certain sense that people say it's a last resort in order to restore the populace, in order to restore polity and ethics. It's almost as if violence has a generative role that can recreate our life. Um, I don't think that's how violence works for Bonhoeffer ultimately. I think for him, he views violence as it's it's a part of the equation that we can live into, which is the judgment of injustice. It becomes like the use of the sword or the first use of the law. Like it's the sort of thing that constrains evil. Sorry, I mean, you know what I mean.
yep.
Um, uh, and so, in a certain sense, it's even disempowering violence more to say whatever Bonhoeffer was doing, violence isn't the thing that renews polity. When violence is at the core of a politic, it begets more violence. And I think that's something we have to reflect on, even within the conspiracy circle. Like, truthfully, if it succeeded, I imagine it making more violence rather than
Mm-hmm.
it would be better than Nazis, but still be a violent regime of
Mm-hmm.
certain sorts. And I think we can talk about that another day. Something else I think has been really important for me is actually discarding the idea that Bonhoeffer could take realistic action to probable ends. This has been a big move within realist readings, as well as people who read Bonhoeffer saying, he took that act as a last resort, and that was the best thing that could be done. But the reality is it's hard to know if it was the best thing. I mean, by all accounts, Bonhoeffer failed pretty miserably at all the things he tried to do in resistance. That sounds mean to say, but it's like Finkenwalde closed down after a couple of years. Um, all the plot attempts failed. His work with the Allies all fell on deaf ears. No one was really willing to say yes to it. And in the end, he was arrested and killed. Bart called the plot hopelessly naive. There's a certain point of saying, like, our ability to guess what is best in an emergency is actually far more limited than we think. But what is incredible to see is that Bonhoeffer has had an effect nevertheless. I use this phrase in the book from Jane Bennett that there's a non-linear causality to it. It's a way of saying that our actions have effects that go beyond us. Like Bonhoeffer has been used by liberation theologians. He's been used by people in the apartheid struggle. He gave a language and has had an influence that exceeded the intentions he thought he could do. And that's really the place where we can hope to see renewal in our political action. And
Mm.
that's what I think ultimately what responsibility is. Responsibility isn't trying to make the best account that we can articulate to others. It's actually just responding in love to the neighbor while trying not to judge who we are. And I think that's at the basis of a strong Christian ethic that he offers us.
All I can say is amen to that. Thank you for your time, Kevin. I really
Thank you,
appreciate it.
Michael. I
Yeah.
appreciate it.